Hey everyone, Sumo Spiffy here. With the Mei Banzuke out and the time for more fantasy sumo at hand, this is a good time for us to talk about the nature of prediction. This whole channel started out on the premise of not just watching sumo, but understanding the sport better and being able to make good predictions about the winners and losers in both single matches and whole bashos. But I've shied away from making a video about how to be more effective in picking those winners and losers because, quite frankly, I've only been decent at making picks for how guys will do for the whole basho. Picking individual matches has traditionally been a disaster. Then I decided, about halfway through March, hey, if I'm routinely shite at those picks, maybe I can help people not by showing them what to do, but what not to do. And it's always fun to revel in a content creator's failures, right? But then March wound up being the best basho I've ever had doing this. I was far from perfect everywhere, but if anything, that convinced me this is the time for this video. After all, I finally have an idea of how to be successful, and I definitely haven't forgotten the ways in which I've failed. So, the thesis of the video is, we're going to talk about how to give yourself the best chance to make good picks, whether you're ass deep into fantasy sumo or just picking winners on your own to test your sumo senses. And that's going to include some easy mistakes people make, which I've made numerous times, which you can hopefully make use of without learning the hard way again and again and again. Let's start by talking about individual matches. I'm not going to spend long here because there's no magic trick for doing well on these picks. In fact, in my view, the most useful thing to talk about is what your goal should be when picking who's gonna win any given sumo match, because the goal should not be to pick the winner. The goal should be to look at a fight and accurately determine which wrestler has a better chance of winning. I treat those ideas as especially distinct here because of the nature of sumo. If you pick a winner in a team sport, for example, if there's a clear gap between those teams, you pick the better team and you'll be right the vast majority of the time. The NFL might say any team can win on any given Sunday, but genuine upsets are rare because a good team doesn't need all its good players to be good to beat a bad team. Players lean on each other when they're having off days. Good teams in most sports are built around either a nice spread of talent or, like in basketball, individuals who are so dominant it's hard for them to have a day so bad it tanks the team on its own. Individual sports like MMA can be a little more difficult to pick because the fighters are totally reliant on themselves. One person's bad day is a bad day for that whole side of the equation, right? But it's still easier to pick winners in those sports because fights usually go pretty long. Pro MMA matches that go the distance are at least 15 minutes. Major boxing matches are usually 30 or more, and talent and skill wins out more frequently over time. When upsets happen, it's commonly because of a knockout that ends the fight early. Situations like Sean Strickland beating Israel Adesanya with the perfect game plan are quite rare. But most sumo matches are over fast. Essentially, the first guy to successfully attack or counterattack wins. If MMA worked like sumo, the win would go not to who's better over 15 minutes, but to the fighter who lands the first strike. That makes the results much more chaotic, even in matches where one wrestler is clearly superior to the other. I look at picking winners here as comparable to playing poker. In poker, if you play every hand with a 60% chance of winning, over the long run, you'll be a winner. But even if you do that, you'll have streaks, sometimes long streaks, where luck keeps going against you. It doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong, it's just the nature of the game. The same idea applies here. Apart from the rare fights where there's genuinely no way one wrestler loses to the other unless the dohyo collapses under him, there's always a chance you'll be wrong about any particular match. But if you can figure out which wrestler has a better chance to win any given fight, even if it's just a 51% chance, over time you'll have more days where you look like a genius rather than look like a scrub. The challenge, of course, is how to successfully determine who's favored. And that genuinely is a challenge because in this age of advanced metrics and finding statistical advantages for one player or team so small you'd never see a difference just by watching the action, in sumo there's not much extra information available to help you make these choices. The main tool available is the head-to-head record between the wrestlers in the match. The overall record and the recent record can both be useful, but recency usually matters more. One famous current example of the difference between overall and recent record is Takayumi versus Tamawashi. Takayumi spent 6.5 years beating Tamawashi's ass up, down, and sideways, and after March 2022, he had a 27-3 head-to-head lead. But that was when he hurt his arm. Since then, Tamawashi is 6-2, and the way they've performed in 2025, even though Mitakeumi still holds a 29-9 lead in the head-to-head, it's hard to imagine him ever winning that fight again. But the head-to-head is usually a hint at best. There will be plenty of instances where the head-to-head record clearly points towards one wrestler, and even if it remains accurate with respect to long-term expectations, the other wrestler can win on any given day. Spend long enough looking at these head-to-heads, and you'll find very few where the wrestlers have fought at least 4 or 5 matches and the same guy has won every time. Still, if you want some kind of information to help you pick, the head-to-head is just about the only hard data available. Take a look at it, just be aware it's not any sort of magic bullet. The best way to get good at predicting individual matches, really, is to know the wrestlers and know the sport. Knowing if someone's injured or being able to observe if they're not fighting the way they usually do helps a lot, but past that, it becomes a matter of time and familiarity. I've looked for all the shortcuts I can, and there just aren't any. But hey, we're watching sumo because we enjoy it, right? And if you watch it regularly, over time you'll start to get a vibe on how guys fight, if they look particularly good or bad during a particular basho, and times when a match that should be favored one way might be more even this time or even swing the other direction. It's tricky, but like I said, don't worry about being perfect. If you want to get better at it, you will, and better is all we can really aim for. Now for the more popular type of predictions, guessing before the basho how wrestlers will do over the full 15 days. In other words, the basis for games like Kachi Clash, Stable Masters, and so on. This is usually easier because over the course of 15 days, a wrestler's unexpected wins and losses will often balance out. This is why the tier lists here place guys within a relatively narrow range of wins. If I'm right that someone should end up at 8 wins, for example, he'll usually land from 7 to 9. Either things mainly go as expected, his surprising wins and losses balance out, or the surprises go mostly one way, but that changes his schedule in a way that also tends to bring his record in line. Of course, no one's picks are ever all correct. That's pretty much impossible. Sometimes they're wrong for reasons outside your control. For example, this past basho had Shona no Umi, Takarafuji, and Nishikigi all become absolute shambles in the same narrow part of the Banzuke. That sort of collapse is difficult to predict for one guy, much less 3. And the knock-on effect was that guys who got to face him had an easier than expected time, which left us with a number of wrestlers who did a little better than expected thanks to being stationed in the free win zone. It is what it is, no big deal. Sometimes there's a mix of error and bad luck. For Kachi Clash in March, I picked Kinbozan. I decided, based on November and January, that his past issues were mostly behind him, and because he wasn't lined up to face the Sanyaku, he should do reasonably well. I only expected 8 or 9 wins with potential upside, but given the more difficult schedule and unreliable health of the Waka Bros, and especially Takayasu, it seemed like a reasonable choice. Obviously, in retrospect, that looks like a terrible pick. It was a bad pick because I showed hope in someone who was by no means guaranteed to hold it together at this higher level, even though I didn't really expect more wins from him than Wakataka Kage, just maybe a better chance at 10. But it wasn't as terrible as Takayasu made it look because Papa Bear's back returned from the grave to let him stomp face for the first time in a year. So, choosing Kinbozan over Wakataka Kage was a mistake, but not choosing Takayasu, based on what we knew at the time, was fine. And other times you just blow it. Moments where you talk yourself into the wrong thing and only later remember there was a voice in your head telling you to stop. Or maybe your choice made perfect sense at the time and later you realize why it was a mistake, but then you fall into the trap again later because it's so easy to do. And when we make these picks based largely on vibes and a general sense of the wrestler's ability, a lot of biases can creep in. There's 3 I find to be pretty common. 1. The bias of dislike. For example, the fact I liked Ryuden Sumo before I found out what a piece of shit he is helps me avoid making unduly harsh predictions due to the bias of dislike. If I hadn't watched him pretty closely, it would be a lot harder to view him accurately. Lots of us dislike certain wrestlers for lots of reasons, and in those cases, this bias can be difficult to escape. 2. The bias of belief. With the aforementioned Kinbozan pick, it was feasible he'd recovered, but over time I convinced myself he was ready to go at this level out of line with all previous evidence. In addition, part of the reason I convinced myself he was a good pick was that, if I was right, it was also a clever pick. So, the bias of belief is a catchy name, but if you want to be more accurate, it's the bias of wanting to be the smartest person in the room. And 3, the bias of past results. This one is trickier because obviously how someone has fought in the past should say a fair bit about how they'll do in at least the near future. If you watch our tier lists, you know I blew the Toki Hayate pick last basho. That's largely a result of this bias. I've been of the opinion that Toki is improving and should eventually make some noise in the division, and soon enough we should expect him to do better. But in November, he beat Takara Fuji and Tamawashi, yet still only hit 6 wins. In January, he was 5-8 before winning his last 2 against badly struggling opponents. So, despite the fact I know the line between winning and losing at this level can be quite thin, and it doesn't take a ton of improvement to start seeing greater success, I assumed his record would stay on the low end. And of course, I was very wrong. So, okay, acknowledging potential bias is fine, but how do we avoid falling into those traps? Well, the best way to work around bias is by putting data to work. One useful piece of data is knowing who's injured, but that generally just applies to a small percentage of wrestlers. The data we can really put to work here across the board is head-to-head records. Now, I can hear some of the reactions. Huh? Then what? And Spiff, have you been drinking? To which I respond, hang on, give me a minute, and yes, but not that much. It might sound odd that head-to-head records are useful for predicting performance for a whole basho, but not so much for the matches in it. It works though because math is a wonderful thing. Remember when I said surprising results generally balance out? That's where the math comes in. If you know someone's almost certain to face 8 particular opponents and he has winning records against half and losing records against half, you cannot assume he'll beat the 4 he has winning records against and lose to the 4 he has losing records against. Generally speaking, however, he's about as likely to lose to someone he most often beats as he is to beat someone he most often loses to. So, in that situation, without a particular reason to think otherwise, 4 wins in that group is still the most likely expectation. He might end up with 3, maybe 5, but you have that good baseline to work from rather than just vibes. Head-to-head data on probable opponents is information I used to gather and make videos about, but the videos didn't get many views, and doing this research manually was far too much effort for the benefit. But now it's all available with a click, courtesy of Chiyo Tsuke, doing the community a solid once again. The tool has existed for a while, but to my shame, I forgot all about it until recently. With this, you choose a wrestler, and you'll get his head-to-head record against everyone across the whole Banzuke. You can even just have the tool show you the results from the last year. Plus, the record is a link that shows you the exact head-to-head history between those 2 guys. To show you how this process works, let's go back and use Toki Hayate as an example. If I'd used this tool to help, how might my prediction have changed? First, we have to have an idea of who he'll fight. For the guy at the bottom, that's pretty easy. He more or less fights up the line until they start shuffling around to make scheduling easier. So we can generally assume he'll fight the 8 guys above him, excluding stablemates since they can't fight each other. Here's how I would have created rough expectations for each of these matchups based on their head-to-heads and my knowledge of the wrestlers. Shirokuma's a 50-50. Even though right now Toki's a little more on the rise, a lot of that is because Shiro is either struggling physically or just hasn't figured out how to use what should be a good sumo body to its fullest potential. Against each other, it can really go either way. Mitakeumi would be the day 2 match, and early basho Mitakeumi is the toughest version. Overall, I would still favor Toki, but only by a little. For Kotoshoho, a 1-0 record really doesn't mean anything. Pre-basho, I would slightly favor Toki because of Kotoshoho's unclear health status. If Kotoshoho was definitely healthy though, I would lean his way. Asakoryu, another 50-50. If either of them were to pull away in the head-to-head long term, I'd think Toki is the more likely one, but right now, it's a very even fight. With Sadanaumi, again, a 2-1 lead for either guy doesn't mean a lot, especially when they've alternated victories. He's never fought Aonishiki, but come on, Aonishiki has to be the considerable favorite here. Juranaumi struggled so badly in January at a mid-level rank, it's hard to know what he'll do this time. Combine that with Toki winning their only 2 fights in the last year, and Toki is probably the favorite. And Toki is 2-0 against Ryuden, and Ryuden is fading, so advantage definitely Toki Hayate. Taking all this into consideration, I would expect Toki to go 2-1 against Ryuden, Aonishiki, and Chura, and then 2 or 3 wins against the rest of the group. That's a total of 5-3 or 4-4. Then, if I had remembered that the guy at the bottom almost certainly is going to end up fighting the guy at the top of Juryo, I could have looked at his record against Tamashoho and said, oh, that's probably another win added on, so now he's either going to be 6-3 or 5-4 against the guys he's almost certainly going to fight. Now, since he's at the bottom and he's fighting up in rank from the start, as the basho continues, all he can do is keep fighting higher and higher in rank. That means, whereas if you have 6 unknown matches for somebody, you'd probably want to assume he'll go 3-3. For the guy at the bottom, it's probably safer to assume he's going to go 2-4 instead. And thus, depending on which one of these starts he has, means he should either finish at 8-7 or 7-8. But how did that play out in reality? Well, he did fight all 9 of those matches and he went 6-3 in those. It's worth noting that the Ryuden match was pushed to day 11 because of fights with Midori Fuji and Fuji Seiyun in between, and in an instance where they had a wider gap in their records, that match might not have happened. But again, since there are only maybe 4 to 6 truly guaranteed matches for guys outside the upper ranks, we're looking for high probability matches so we have more information to lean on. The surprise, of course, is that in those other 6 matches, he ended up going 4-2. If you knew the schedule would include Midori Fuji, Fuji Seiyun, Shonen Naomi, Meisei, Tamawashi, and friggin' Kirishima, 2-4 starts looking pretty good. But guys put in surprising performances sometimes. This method can't control for that happening in the unknown matches, but it's actually quite good at finding the expected win range for a wrestler's predictable fights. We just have to know how many opponents we can reasonably predict for any given wrestler. It's easier to do for some ranks than others. For the bottom 5 wrestlers, check the bottom 8 potential opponents. So, you draw a little box over the bottom 9 guys because that includes them, so look at their records against the other 8. In addition, you may also want to check how they do against the guy who they should fight in Juryo. The bottom guy fights the top guy in Juryo, the second last guy fights the second highest guy in Juryo, and so on. But the higher you go, keep in mind, the less likely that match is going to happen. It requires there being an odd number of wrestlers in Makuuchi for enough days for that match to happen, and you never know how many of those there's going to be. There's usually 1, probably 2 or 3, but beyond that it gets questionable. For the next 4 up, check the bottom 10 opponents. This gets a little squirrely because they'll generally face 8 or 9 rather than all 10, but the reason we look at 10 is because it's hard to know which 1 or 2 of these guys is going to be skipped. There are some tendencies depending on the exact placement, but if I break it down slot by slot, it's going to turn into information overload. An example will probably help, so let's look at Aonishiki. This also lets us see how to handle a new hotshot without much data to go on, just sumo knowledge and observation. So if we draw a line and see where we want to stop, the first thing we might notice is he lost to Ryuden and Shishi in January. Now Shishi's also on the upswing and Ryuden's tricky against guys who fight in vulnerable looking ways, but Aonishiki is young and learning and should be better than both of them, so let's say for the moment he's gonna split those fights. Who else in this group looks like they can beat him? Well, maybe a couple could, but nobody looks like a favorite. If we think he's going to beat everyone else though, I guess that means we're predicting an 8-1 start in this group, and that's really risky, especially when we're talking about someone who's never fought half of the guys in this cohort. So figure something dumb is going to happen, so we'll just knock that down to 7-2, or if he only fights 8 of the guys instead of 9, maybe he's only 6-2. That's a lot more reasonable for somebody who is very good but has very little track record against his prospective opponents. Now after that, because he's still pretty low, he's also going to have to deal with the Toki Hayate problem of continuing to fight up in rank. But again, he's very good. So figure he's probably going to do a little bit better than expected, but what does that mean? If he fights 6 unknown matches, that's maybe 4-2. If he fights 7 unknown matches, maybe that's 5-2, maybe that's 4-3. What we're looking at with him is if he really starts popping off, then he's going to have to fight the Sanyaku, and the Sanyaku are the most likely guys to take him down a peg. If he starts losing early, he'll have easier fights towards the end and probably get more wins then, but he will have picked up those losses earlier on. So with these reasonable ranges, if we go with the lowest end outcomes, he still finishes 10-5. If we go with the highest end outcomes, then we've got him at 12-3. So again, being new, stick with the low end, stick with the safer bet. 10 or 11 wins, that's probably what we're looking at. As it turned out, he faced all 9 guys who didn't get hurt. He went 6-3 in those matches, which was slightly below expectations. Now, in retrospect, it looked like his losses the first 2 days were him finding his footing, so it makes sense he started blasting in the back half, even though the ranks of his opponents went up, and brought his record back around to what we predicted. From there up through Maegashira 6, we're looking at 9 potential opponents. Whoever shares the wrestler's rank, then 4 guys above and 4 guys below. So if we're looking at Nishikigi, for example, we would want to see Shonen Umi, who is sharing his rank, and then the 4 guys, the 2 ranks above, and the 4 guys, the 2 ranks below. As it turns out, the tool handles stable conflicts really well, and this is where we can find the guys to show us that. If we choose Midori Fuji, you'll see a lot of guys with these slanted lines. Those are the ones who are stablemates, who he is not going to be able to fight. Now, he does have an 0-2 record against Nishiki Fuji. That's because they fought in playoffs in the lower divisions. You can fight a stablemate in a playoff, but not at any other time. Everyone else, there's no record because he hasn't fought him because he can't fight him. So rather than just going with the guy across, Meisei, and then 2 ranks up and 2 ranks down, we actually have to count the 4 guys. So going up, it's looking at Nishikigi, Shonen Umi, Endo, and Oshoma, and going down, it's Onokatsu, Shishi, Ryuden, and Chura Umi. And as we can see, he fought 7 of those guys the first 7 days, Oshoma near the end, and he only skipped Chura Umi because Chura was in the Yusho race and ended up with a much different schedule than expected. The guy just outside the Joy, number 17 in the division, has the hardest schedule to predict. He'll probably have a couple Sanyaku fights, but not until much later, and it's very difficult to know which ones he'll face. And he could be forced into more Sanyaku fights if there's an injury in the Maegashira ranks above him, or even if there are enough scheduling conflicts to force the committee to reach further down the ranks for opponents. More injuries can extend this issue to the number 18 guy, maybe even number 19, but number 17 is the most problematic to predict. In March, since there were 7 Sanyaku, that means this guy was Kinbozan at Maegashira 5 West. Since he's the other truly bad pick I mentioned, let's give him the Toki Hayate treatment. How would a prediction for him have worked? Well, start by assuming everyone relevant will stay healthy and not impact his schedule. Generally speaking, he'll fight 4 West and 5 East, but 5 East is a stablemate, so that one can't happen. That creates a better chance that he'll fight 4 East, but 4 East usually gets dragged up the ranks, so that's not something you want to rely on. Instead, let's start by taking 4 West and then the 3 ranks below him, 6, 7, and 8. That gives us 7 opponents. Then assume that if you take Takayasu and the 2 guys below that group we just talked about, Hakuoho and Endo, he's gonna fight 2 of those 3. So we've got 7 that should be definite and 3 where he's probably gonna fight him. Let's count on him fighting 2 of those guys. Well, Hirota Umi is by far his best matchup. Ichi Yamamoto and Tamawashi are pretty favorable. He's had recent success against them. He's 2-3 against Shodai and Oshoma, but more importantly, he's lost the last couple to each one. He's 0-3 against Atami Fuji. Now, they haven't fought in a year, and Atami Fuji might be breaking down pretty badly, but 0-3 is 0-3, and we should assume that Atami is the favorite unless proven otherwise. And then he's 1-0 against Takeru Fuji, but one match is one match, and that doesn't necessarily say very much. So if we've got 3 pretty reasonable upside fights, 3 sorted downside fights, but not as down as the other ones are up, and then 1 definite question mark with Takeru Fuji, we can call that a 4-3 prediction for those matches. As for that group of 3, Takayasu, he's 2-1 against him, but they haven't fought since 2023, and the most meaningful factor in that fight might very well be Takayasu's health. Similarly, he's only 1-0 against Hakuoho. That one was just in November, but Hakuoho is also recovering from injury, and his health then versus his health now may be relevant. And then Endo, 2-2, but once again, the most relevant thing here is gonna be his opponent's health. Endo has good days and bad days, and before the basho, you don't know which one is gonna show up when Kinbozan comes calling. So let's just make it easy on ourselves, say that he's gonna go 1-1 there, and that gives us a final record for those 9 presumed matches of 5-4. Now, what about the Sanyaku? Again, he's only going to fight a couple guys and we don't know who it's going to be. That being the case, we kind of have to go with how he tends to do against the Sanyaku as opposed to trying to pick out how he does against particular opponents. And it's not great. Hasn't beaten Hoshoryu, hasn't beaten Daisho. Like one win. The only guy he's got 2 wins against is Kirishima. If he fights Kirishima, you probably want to like his chances there, but against anybody else, who knows? So if he gets 2 of those fights, which would be pretty normal for the guy just outside the Joy, and the rest are against Maegashira opponents, he splits those. Instead of 3-3, we probably need to assume he'll go 2-4. That gives us a final prediction of 7-8. If you're feeling more confident about his chances against the Sanyaku, maybe you call it 8-7, but looking at this, it wouldn't be reasonable to go any higher than that. As it turned out, the 7 definite opponents were his first 7 matches, and he only went 3-4 against them. But he picked up Hakuoho and Endo and went 2-0 there, which meant against the whole group he was 5-4, exactly as predicted. The 6-9 collapse is because he did horrendously against everyone else. He only beat Shonen no Umi on the last day. He didn't even beat Nishikigi. Now I grant Nishikigi is a difficult matchup for him, but still, it was pretty freaking bad. However, even though that's clearly an outlier kind of performance, even if he'd done better, even if he'd gone 3-3 the rest of the way and finished 8-7, more like what we expected, more like what I expected without doing any of this work before the basho, this still would have been a bad pick. The reason is that even that mediocre 7-8 prediction didn't take into account the possibility of a Maegashira injury above him making his life harder. If you take out any of these guys, all of a sudden, he's got more Sanyaku matches, and like I said, he doesn't do well against most of these guys. So where I expected Kinbozan to be an 8-7 guy with upside, as it turns out 8-7 was the upside. That's where the real mistake was, and I'd have been much more likely to see it if I'd gone less off vibes and more off of this. The bottom of the Joy is a little more predictable, like a little. You can expect they'll face most of the Sanyaku generally from the top down. Definitely check their records against the Yokozuna and the Ozeki. Also check their records against the Sekiwake and the Komusubi. If there are any injuries above them, they'll almost certainly fight all the Sanyaku. If there are not any injuries and nothing weird happens, probably one of those fights is going to get skipped, but you never know which one. So still, take them all into consideration. Then look at the 3 Maegashira guys above them and the 3 Maegashira guys below. So if we're doing Ichiyamamoto, we would want to look at Takayasu, Tobizaru, Takanosho, then Ura, Kinbozan, and Hiradeumi. Again, if no one is hurt, this should be who they'll face, but any relevant injuries can skew this as well. Top Maegashira, check the full Sanyaku and surrounding Maegashira up to 13 total. This includes everyone who has a Sanyaku matchup on day 1. If there's an odd number of Sanyaku, that's going to go down to Maegashira 3 East. If there was an even number of Sanyaku, then it would go down to Maegashira 3 West. That group is expected to and should fight the whole Sanyaku. With 7 guys in the Sanyaku now, that means 6 Maegashira opponents. For most of them, that just means you're going to draw a box like this all the way around Takayasu, and then you've got your 14 guys, them and their 13 opponents. But for Tobizaru, you would want to look at Gonayama, Chiyoshomo, Wakamoto Haru, and 3 down, Takanosho, Takayasu, Ichiyamamoto. And in March, he did fight all those guys and still ended up fighting Wakataka Kage. Now, exactly which Maegashira opponents they face is gonna end up depending somewhat on records, but the reason you can kind of count on this is because unlike in past years, they've been keeping this group against each other as much as possible. Even though records might indicate that somebody who's struggling should go down quite a bit in rank to find opponents, that doesn't necessarily happen that much. They will put guys in Maegashira 1 through 3, maybe 1 through 4, against each other as long as their records allow for even the slightest argument that it makes sense to do so. That makes their schedules a little more reliable and thus easier for us to make predictions on. Sekiwake and Komusubi, the lower Sanyaku. Check all their Sanyaku opponents, then all the Maegashira from the top down until you get to 13 total opponents. So remember, Sanyaku of 7 means each of the guys in it have 6 Sanyaku opponents. So we need to check them out and then 7 Maegashira. That takes us down to Takayasu, and once again, this is our box. Now, it's definitely possible for one or two of these matches to get skipped depending on who's performing well and who isn't, but which ones depend on the exact rank. Komusubi should get the full Sanyaku slate and then potentially miss like the last Maegashira match or two in this group, whereas the Sekiwake should get all the expected Maegashira, but if they're doing poorly, they could get taken out of a late day fight against a Yokozuna or an Ozeki. But the reason we're limiting this to 13 rather than trying to predict all 15 is because of how commonly the Sekiwake and Komusubi are used to test Maegashira contenders. So we're creating that little bit of padding, which means the Sekiwake and Komusubi are that much more likely to fight everyone in this group of 13. And finally, the Yokozuna and Ozeki. We can pretty much figure on what their 15-day schedule is going to be. Now, do some matches get broken? Yeah, for sure. But again, it's difficult to know which ones those are going to be. So if we're talking about Hoshoryu, for example, we've got the 6 Sanyaku members and then 9 Maegashira. From Maegashira 1 down to 5 East, and that is Ura. Now, something to keep in mind is that for the guy at the top, he's gonna fight the bottom Komusubi guy on day 1, and then from there, he's gonna go basically 2, 3, 4. It's not gonna go always in that exact order, but he's going to fight these 9 guys on the next 9 days. That's the way his schedule is set up. If stuff gets broken at the end, it's gonna be one of these matches. The number 2 guy is largely the same, but the number 3 guy can change a little bit. But to keep it simple, for anyone at Yokozuna and Ozeki, just take the top 15 guys and you'll have their whole schedule with a very high degree of accuracy. And just for giggles, let's try one last prediction. Would we have figured that Onosato would do so well he wins the Yusho? Well, if we look at these top 9 opponents, he's obviously a favorite against Ura, against Tobizaru, against Gonoyama, against Wakamoto Haru, against Chiyoshima. Ichiyamamoto, he only lost to 1 time, but that was a while ago, so that's a question mark at best, but realistically, it's Onosato. You gotta figure he's the favorite. Now, Takano Sho has beaten him twice, but both times Takano Sho was Maegashira 6 in title contention and was able to take it to the big guy. Now, in Maegashira 3, he's going to get the Sanyaku early and often, which is going to make things a lot harder. So Onosato is probably the favorite there too. Now, Takayasu, they've only fought once, but Takayasu is always potentially a problem, and Waka Takakage has obviously proven to be an issue as well. So if we figure those 2 guys, he's still obviously very competitive. If he goes 1-1, that's 8-1. Now, unlike with Aonishiki, who had no record against his potential opponents, Onosato has a pretty decent record here. But again, against some of these guys, he has not much of a record, and he has a maximum of 5 fights against any of them. So if you want to play it safe and say, well, it's more likely he's going to go 7-2 than 9-0, I want to go a little bit on the low end. If you wanted to say 7-2 here, that's fine, that's nice and safe, but you really don't want to go below that. Well, what about against the Sanyaku? Well, Hoshoryu obviously has a major advantage against him. Koto Sakura, they alternate wins against each other, but Koto is hurt, give him the advantage there. Obviously, he kind of smashes Oho, he smashes Daisho, he smashes Kirishima. Abi is kind of a problem. Abi has proven to be an issue. So here, you've got 1 definite downside fight, 3 definite upside fights, 1 possible upside fight depending on Koto's health, and then against Abi, you'd think he's a favorite, but who knows at this point? Alright, let's just say he finishes 4-2 here. So depending on which one of these you pick, then your prediction is either 12-3 or 11-4. And lo and behold, he went 12-3 and he won the Yusho. But he does really well against lots of guys. You're gonna predict 12 wins routinely. What about that time he went to Ozeki, finished 9-6? Would we have predicted that? Well, fortunately, Chiyo's tool actually lets us go back to previous Banzukes, and even better, it shows us the head-to-head records against each guy before that tournament, not what the head-to-head records are now. So here, we have to scratch out Terunofuji because he didn't fight in that one. Now, he had just won his last fight against Hoshoryu, so it looked like he might have been figuring Hoshoryu out, but Hoshoryu obviously still has to be considered a favorite here. Him and Koto Sakura were still flip-flopping fights. He smashed Daisho, he smashed Kirishima, smashed Waka. I mean, Shodai, I guess big game Shodai could show up, but he's got to be considered a favorite there. So depending on what you think about Kotozakura, you might go 4-2 on the safe side, maybe 5-1. Think about the fact that he just got promoted to Ozeki. If you put any credence into the Ozeki hangover thing, you know, let's say 4-2. That's very safe. Shouldn't do any worse than that. Then we look at the Maegashira. Again, we're going down to 5 East. Tobizaru smashes. Churi Naomi, he should smash. Oshoma, he should smash. Atami Fuji, smash. Ura, smash. Oho, smash. Hiradaumi had been giving him problems, so is he maybe a question mark? I don't know. Waka Takakage had beaten him in their only meeting. Again, it's only one match, but Waka looked really good in it. Maybe. Abi had just gotten the first win in the matchup, and you could see how he might be a problem in the future, but Onosato is obviously better than him, so, you know, he's a little bit of a favorite. Maybe he's a little bit of a favorite against Hiradaumi still. So figure he's got, against the Maegashira guys, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 wins lined up. And again, if you figure 2 out of 3 of the other matches are wins, that's 8-1. If you're a little more sketchy about it, then he's 7-2. But if you take the worst ends of these, you're still assuming 11-4 as his final outcome, and he only finished 9-6. So what ended up being wrong? Now, it's easy to say he had an outlier performance, he just had an unusually bad performance, but in what way? Well, look at who he lost to. He lost to Abi, he lost to Waka, he lost to Hoshoryu, he lost to Kotozakura. Those were 4 guys we pointed out as people who could beat him. It's just that in any given tournament, we wouldn't expect all 4 of them to beat him. We would expect him to probably win 2 of those fights, if not 3. But they're difficult enough for him to beat that we'd still be surprised if he won all 4, right? So going 0-4 against that group was the major outlier that threw this prediction off. The only really surprising loss was the one to Daisho, right? Even Takano Sho, he'd lost to him before. Takano Sho was on a run. This wasn't out of line by any means. So I understand if it looks like I'm trying to protect this new method and make it look better and shine it up, but realistically, if he had gone 2-2 against that group of 4, as we would expect in most circumstances, he would have finished 11-4, which was exactly what we predicted. In no way am I saying that this method is going to land great predictions every time for nearly every guy. These kind of outlier performances, good or bad, like think about Toki Hayate as well, will skew away from what you expect looking at these numbers. But the numbers can set you on the right track, and even in this case, where we looked at Onosato and we're like, what is going on? Why are you fighting so badly compared to our expectations? It wasn't that far off. Now, to be clear about something else, the results here are going to be a little less reliable if you go purely off the head-to-head numbers and don't know when to make adjustments, especially for injury. Still, it should be pretty good. And as you learn more about the sport, you'll be able to make those adjustments more and more successfully. So, now that we have this method, hey, let's just keep it between us, okay? Cool. And that's the prediction video. I'll put these methods to use for the tier list, but let me know in the comments if you see anything else that can go into this, especially with respect to how many predictable fights each wrestler gets doing the pre-basho predictions, or with the individual match predictions. I'd love to be wrong about there being no shortcuts. But anyway, have a great day, and I will see you soon.